Hollywood, it never really sleeps. It just changes its masks. There was a time when the silver screen didn't just show stories, it created gods. Perfect smiles, flawless romances, heroes who always stood tall in the final scene. But I spent enough years around this industry to learn something most people never see. Behind the cameras, behind the applause, there were different stories unfolding. My name is Paul Newman. And if there's one truth I learned in Hollywood, it's this: the brighter the spotlight, the deeper the shadows it casts. Tonight, I want to take you back, not to the Hollywood you remember, but the one that lived behind closed doors. 9 actors. 9 legends. And 9 stories the public never fully understood. Not accusations. Not absolutes. Just the echoes of reports, rumors, biographies, and memories that never quite matched the image on screen. Let's begin. He was everything Hollywood wanted in a star. Errol Flynn, the sword-wielding, devil-may-care hero of the adventures of Robin Hood. On screen, he was freedom itself. Off-screen, he lived like nothing could ever touch him. But fame has a way of catching up. By the early 1940s, Flynn found himself surrounded by controversy. There were highly publicized court proceedings and allegations involving his private life, stories that dominated headlines and divided public opinion. Some called it scandal. Others called it exaggeration. The truth, as always, sat somewhere in between the noise. What struck people who worked with him wasn't just the controversy, it was the contradiction. A man capable of charm so effortless it disarmed entire rooms, and yet living under constant scrutiny that never seemed to fade. Hollywood protected its biggest names back then. Studios had reputations to preserve, and Flynn's image as the ultimate adventurer was too valuable to lose. But behind the applause, there was always tension between myth and man. Joan Crawford was not just an actress, she was discipline turned into art. From silent films to Mildred Pierce, she built herself into a symbol of ambition. Every eyebrow, every movement, every smile was controlled. But control can become something else when taken too far. Over the years, biographies and personal accounts, most famously from her adopted children, painted a far more complicated domestic picture than the glamorous public image suggested. Some described strict household rules, emotional distance, and intense expectations that blurred the line between discipline and fear. Whether every detail is remembered accurately or shaped by time and emotion is still debated. But what is undeniable is that Joan Crawford lived in constant performance mode even off camera. Friends often said she never truly left the stage. Even her kindness felt rehearsed. Even her love felt structured. Hollywood saw a star who had mastered herself completely. But mastery sometimes comes at a cost only those closest to you ever understand. If you close your eyes and think of peace, you might hear Bing Crosby. White Christmas. Silent Night. A voice that defined comfort for an entire generation. But behind that warmth, there were accounts that complicated the image of the perfect family man. His son Gary Crosby later wrote about a childhood that did not always match the harmony of his father's public persona. His memoir described a strict and often emotionally difficult home environment, painting a picture of discipline that felt heavy for some of his children. These accounts sparked debate for decades, some defending Crosby, others pointing to a more troubled private life than his songs suggested. What I learned over the years is that audiences rarely separate the voice from the man. But they are not the same thing. Bing Crosby's legacy remains one of music's brightest. Yet like many stars of his era, the private reality was far more complicated than the recordings that made him immortal. Kirk Douglas was fire on screen. Spartacus. Paths of Glory. A man who looked like he could never be broken. But Hollywood backlots were full of whispers, and Douglas was no stranger to them. Accounts from various biographies and industry insiders often described him as intensely driven, sometimes to the point of intimidation. There were stories of difficult sets, power struggles, and relationships that blurred professional and personal boundaries in ways that modern Hollywood would later question far more seriously. Yet it's also important to understand something about that era. Boundaries were different, and much of what was considered normal then would be scrutinized today. Douglas himself, in later years, often reflected on his aggressive ambition and the cost it carried in his relationships and reputation. He lived long enough to see his image evolve from dominant leading man to reflective elder of Hollywood. And perhaps that is its own kind of truth. Time reshapes even the strongest legends. Bette Davis never tried to be liked. She tried to be unforgettable. And she succeeded. On screen, she was volcanic, unpredictable, sharp, unforgettable. Off-screen, she carried the same intensity into her working relationships. Stories from sets over the years describe clashes, strong opinions, and a personality that refused to soften for anyone. Her legendary rivalry with Joan Crawford became Hollywood folklore, later amplified by books and dramatizations that blurred fact with theatrical retelling. But Davis herself often said she simply demanded excellence and refused anything less. Was she difficult? Many said yes. Was she cruel? Others disagreed. Was she honest in a dishonest system? That question lingers even today. In Hollywood's golden age, women were often expected to be agreeable. Bette Davis never agreed to that role. And that alone made her controversial. Clark Gable was called the King of Hollywood. And kings are rarely questioned in their own time. On screen, he was effortless masculinity. Gone with the Wind made him immortal. But behind the scenes, accounts from co-stars and production staff occasionally described a man shaped by an entirely different Hollywood, one where power dynamics were rarely discussed openly. Vivien Leigh and others working on major productions sometimes spoke about discomforts and tensions that reflected the broader studio system rather than any single individual. Gable was not alone in this. He was part of a machine that treated leading men as untouchable symbols. And symbols, by nature, are rarely examined too closely while they are still being worshipped. What stands out today is not scandal, but the weight of expectation placed on someone who was never allowed to be ordinary. If there is one story that truly defines Hollywood's darker machinery, it may be Judy Garland. She was not a predator. She was not a myth of cruelty. She was, by most accounts, a victim of a system that demanded perfection at any cost. From a young age, she was placed under extreme pressure by studio expectations, long working hours, strict control over diet, appearance, and performance. Biographies and historical accounts widely document how the studio system of that era pushed young performers beyond what would be acceptable today. Judy Garland's brilliance never faded on screen. But off-screen, her life became a struggle with exhaustion, dependency, and emotional strain. What makes her story so haunting is not just what happened but how normal it once was considered within the industry. She wasn't destroyed by a single person. She was worn down by a system built on consumption. Marlon Brando changed acting forever. He didn't perform emotions, he lived them. But people who worked closely with him often described chaos alongside brilliance. He could be unpredictable, deeply private, and emotionally turbulent. On sets, directors sometimes struggled with his methods. Co-stars sometimes found him difficult to read. His personal life, heavily covered by the media, reflected both extraordinary talent and deep inner conflict. Brando was not a product of Hollywood's golden age in the traditional sense. He helped dismantle it. But even he could not escape its contradictions. Because in Hollywood, genius and instability often shared the same room. And sometimes the audience couldn't tell which was which. So what does all of this mean? It would be easy to turn these stories into judgment. But that misses the point entirely. Hollywood's golden age was never simply good or bad. It was a machine, beautiful, powerful, and deeply flawed. It created legends, but it also demanded sacrifice. It shaped icons, but it rarely asked what it cost to become one. I've lived long enough in this industry to understand something simple. Fame doesn't reveal character. It amplifies it. Or sometimes, distorts it completely. The people you see on screen are not the full story. They never were. They are fragments. Carefully lit. Carefully edited. Carefully preserved. And behind every perfect frame, there is always a life the camera never captured. So the next time you watch one of those old films, remember this. You are not just watching Hollywood's golden age. You are watching its illusion. And like all illusions, it was never meant to last forever. The screen goes black. No music. Just silence, and the faint sound of film burning through a projector.